Hi, welcome to In Conversation With, a series of discussions with people who hold advanced degrees in the life sciences about their careers and career journeys. My name is Chandrima Majumdar, and I'm a postdoc at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm also a member of the ASBMB Education and Professional Development Committee.
And hi, I'm Chris Heinen. I'm a professor of medicine at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine and the director of postdoctoral affairs here at UConn Health. And I'm also a member of the ASBMB Education and Professional Development Committee. And we're excited to be hosting this series of conversations about the vast array of careers available to grad students and postdocs in the life sciences.
Yeah, so today we're delighted to have with us one of my former lab mates and close friends, Dr. Cindy Khuu. Cindy is the manager of regulatory affairs at Cytokinetics in South San Francisco. Cindy, it's so great to see you again and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's good to see everyone and good to meet you, Chris. It's so weird having doctor instead of my name since I don't normally put that there.
But hey, you're a doctor, and for a lot of people, after they graduate their PhDs, their career paths kind of diverge into research and academia or research and industry. But you're kind of in this space where you're supporting crucial projects in industry without directly being involved in research. Could you tell us a little bit more about your job and what your day-to-day looks like?
Yeah, of course. So like you mentioned, I am a manager in the regulatory affairs department. I'm more on the clinical strategy side of regulatory affairs. So there's a few different, I guess, subspecialties you can have in regulatory. And so for what I normally do is I support clinical development of our drug candidates. And so a lot of what my job works or is working with, the other departments to understand for example, competitive space of our molecules, as well as trying to further our understanding of how our drug candidates affect disease, as well as how, that they might help disease. And so my job is a lot of meetings and working with other groups to, figure out what our best path forward is and how to increase our understanding of that so that we can eventually file for marketing authorization to market and commercialize our drugs.
That's awesome. That sounds pretty interesting. Did you realize this is what you wanted to do when you were in grad school?
Well, I went to grad school thinking I wanted to be a bench scientist.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until towards the end of grad school that I really learned about what regulatory affairs was, and then kind of took that step to get an internship and then ultimately, pursue a job in the space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like thinking back, I feel like there's not that much of a conversation about careers outside of the bench, like
Yeah.
regulatory affairs. How did you go about like finding information about these kind of careers and finding an internship to go into?
So one thing I really appreciated about where we went to grad school at UC Davis is the designated emphasis in biotechnology. And
Mm-hmm.
so through that program, I was able to connect with other professionals in the space
Mm-hmm.
who did what I did, where they had a PhD in the life sciences and then decided to pursue a career outside of the bench. So I was able to reach out to them and talk to them about what their job looked like, and then helped, and then eventually got a internship for while I was in grad school. So that was kind of how I got into the space, and then use that internship to understand what clinical research really looks like, because that's
Mm-hmm.
also something that I think we don't really talk about in grad school either, because a lot of it is basic science, at least for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I was also part of this designated emphasis in biotechnology program, and I thought it was really helpful to learn about additional career paths that we don't generally think about. So, in terms of your internship, how did you go about setting that up?
So I essentially just cold applied to the internship because I didn't know anyone at the company. I didn't know, anything about what it really took to get the internship in regulatory. And it was also during COVID. So I was not sure if companies were doing internships for students at the bench. And so I did still want to get my foot in the door, meeting people in the biotech space and, being able to chat with them and things like that.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the internship and sort of what that meant? I mean, was this a full-time job? Was this a paid internship? Sort of just the structure of that, what that experience
Yeah, sure. It was a full-time job. So it was a summer internship, so I was able to take the summer away from lab, so I guess grad school, and to do the internship. And it was a paid internship, 40 hours a week. And it was really interesting being away from the bench for 3 months because I didn't, we were in grad school. That's not really a thing that you do. A lot of, grad students don't do that. And so it was a full-time job that I had for those 3 months and working with, the regulatory team as well as other departments to do the project that I was working on.
And just so you were still in grad school when you started that internship,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
yeah.
At what point were you in this process, in your grad school process?
I think it was the summer between was it my 4th and 5th year, or was it my 5th and 6th year?
Okay.
Chandrima, do you remember?
I want to say it was your 4th and 5th, yeah.
Yeah, so I was already a senior grad student in the lab.
Sure. And how far away are you from graduation? Like another year away from graduation at that point? Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, so I did the internship and then went back to school for almost an entire year, and then was on filing fee and then graduated in the fall. So yeah, about a year.
So what was that conversation like with your PI? Were they supportive of that decision, or were they kind of hesitant? Tell us about that if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, I think our PI she's had, students who have done the designated emphasis in biotechnology, or the DEB, before.
Okay.
And so she was already aware of, the requirements for the program, which includes the internship. And so because it's something that you kind of opt into at the beginning of grad school, she was already aware that I would need to do the internship. I think the conversation was more about the timing of when to do the internship. Obviously, most internships are over the summer, so it would have to be a summer internship. And then depending on, my project and school, and I guess at the time, the pandemic, we kind of landed on this is when I'm planning to do the internship. So she was aware that I was, applying to the internship and interviewing for internships. And so I would say she was pretty supportive of, students doing an internship.
Yeah. So sorry, just to keep on this for just a second, because I think this is really interesting, and I think some of our PhD students who are hearing this might be interested in this topic and something they might be considering. So from your standpoint, what was that transition like, away from your project temporarily, and then perhaps more importantly, coming back to your project? I mean, was it terribly disruptive? Did you kind of sink right back in and it didn't throw you off too much, or what was your sort of experience?
Well, I guess I never fully stepped away from the lab. I mean, I was still, in contact with my lab mates, about, things that were going on. I wasn't, obviously I wasn't going into the lab doing any experiments, but I would help, troubleshoot if needed, or if, there was some questions that needed answering, I was still available. So it wasn't something that I was, completely disconnected from, and I didn't ghost the lab for 3 months. But I guess coming back also, it was a little more difficult because that was the longest, I guess, break that I'd ever taken from research. Personally, I went straight from my undergrad degree to grad school. And so I had never really taken an extended, break away from the lab. So that was interesting, but it it was short enough that my muscle memory still kicked in when I came back. So that was good.
And you had supportive lab mates who welcomed you back, right? And
Yes,
helped you
yes.
transition back.
Yeah, I would say we have a very supportive lab.
Yeah,
In some
very
ways, we never even let her go. We'd keep bugging her with like, what do we do now? And do you want to hang out?
good.
So
Yeah.
there's something to be said about having a good lab environment. I
Hmm.
do want to jump in a little bit about the point of timing of the internship. And
Hmm.
personally, having done an internship myself, I found it most useful to do it towards the end of grad
Hmm.
school because that's when you're kind of doing this career exploration thing. And also, people that you intern with remember you for when you
Hmm.
graduate and are looking for a job. You're still like fresh in their memory. They remember how you worked and
Hmm.
how you were at the company. So that's usually a good time
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah, I agree. It's a lot easier to reach out to them afterwards and say, "Oh, hey, remember when we talked, 6 months ago, a year ago," as
Hmm.
opposed to, "Oh, remember when I interned for you 3 years ago," or something like that. Um, but I do understand that sometimes it's a little more difficult towards the end of grad school because you are trying to finish up. Maybe you're writing your thesis. And so the timing can be a little tricky.
Yeah. And that is like a lot more, personal towards where you are in your grad
Hmm.
school career journey.
Hmm.
Um, I just want to get back to the internship one more time. Uh, you did it over the summer and you said it was a pretty short internship. How long did it take you to get trained up to do that job? Because that wasn't something you'd done before. And how was the training process?
So that's a funny question because what I did during the internship is not at all exactly what I do today
Mm-hmm.
in my current position. So my project for the internship was more focused on trying to build the kind of paper trail,
Mm-hmm.
um, and or more organized the documents that we had. And so I was looking at kind of all of the documents as at once, as opposed to currently in my job, we're still in clinical development, and so
Mm-hmm.
we're assembling that currently. I was working on a different product at the time, so it's some of the nuances of product development are different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the project did help me get a lot of context to what my job currently is.
I see.
Yeah.
And were there like some skills that you were able to transfer over from your experience in grad school towards your internship and like your job right now?
Hmm.
Or was everything something you just had to learn on the fly?
I would say a lot of it is learning on the job,
Mm-hmm.
but some of the more transferable skills are things like being organized, being able to manage a project. Um, I've had to manage a vendor in my current position. So things like that in grad school where, you are working with, a vendor or you're getting quotes for equipment. Those are
Mm-hmm.
things that I've, needed to do where I need to look at a quote and assess whether or not that's kind of reasonable for what we're asking them for, comparing things from different vendors, um, and things like that. So they're more the soft skills and like working with other people. So I think in our lab, I was the only biologist in our lab of
Mm-hmm.
chemists.
Yep.
And so I got really good at working with people who are from other disciplines,
Mm-hmm.
um, and understanding where my line is of what my knowledge is versus like when do I need to reach out to you, for example, Chandrima, for, hey, I need someone who better understands the chemistry to help
Mm-hmm.
me understand what I'm looking at.
Right.
And that's something I do in my job a lot, where regulatory is not always the subject matter expert, or we call them
Mm-hmm.
SMEs. We're not, usually not the SME for certain things. And so I need to reach out to the chemist
Mm-hmm.
or, the pharmacologist, so that they can help us understand, what the data means. And
Mm-hmm.
they're looking at the data, whereas I'm not interpreting the data.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And you were also the safety officer in our lab, so I'm sure you had to do
Mm-hmm.
a ton of paperwork at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like you did a really beautiful job of connecting your experience in grad school, like, you're talking with people in other subject matter experiences and understanding where your knowledge ends and their knowledge
Mm-hmm.
begins, and use that to pitch it to your future company for a
Mm-hmm.
job. Can you elaborate a little bit about some of the skills that people who are doing their PhDs right now can work on to develop while they're in grad school if they're looking for a career in regulatory affairs?
Yeah. I think, yeah, being able to understand yourself and
Mm-hmm.
what your boundaries are of your knowledge, but also being able to communicate across different functional areas. So
Mm-hmm.
able to explain, for me as a biologist, being able to explain to a chemist what we're looking at in a
Mm-hmm.
way that they understand so that they can help me with our problems.
Right.
Because as in industry, for the most part, it's, a lot of people against the same problem, and it's
Mm-hmm.
the company's, problem, or the company's question that they're trying to answer. And you need a lot of different people to answer the same question. So how can we all work together to answer that question? And what questions do I ask from, as a biologist standpoint, for example, versus like what questions are there on the chemistry side? What questions are there from the pharmacology side? So the same question might have, different angles. And so being able to work with other people is a really big part of my job, I would say, is like being able to interface with people and ask questions that, the other person understands and can provide you with a complete answer, as opposed to, like, I don't understand what you're asking me, so I can't help you yet.
Mm-hmm.
So things like working with other people, being able to communicate with people who are not subject matter experts is really important. Um, and so a lot of what I do is no longer in the technical space of having a PhD. It's more in, science communication and being able to see kind of the big picture of clinical development, or, development of a drug candidate to a marketed drug.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the science background. You
Mm-hmm.
you are a doctor. We've established here, and so, but from the sort of the regulatory affairs side of
Mm-hmm.
that, is there formal training that you had to undergo as part of your job today? Is there like certification, or is that just something that you pick up along the way?
So I did not undergo formal training besides on the job training.
Okay.
There are certifications that you can get for regulatory affairs, and that's one thing I'm actually looking into. So there's a regulatory affairs certification you can get, but for my understanding is you do have to have some amount of on-the-job training before you can
Great.
take the exam for the certification.
Okay.
And so
what would change if you were to do the certification? Do you have a sense of that for you?
for me, I think it's more, the exam and the certification are more broad than what most of us focus on. So I think for me, it would help me get a bigger picture of kind of what all the regulations are, what are some of the things that I don't always work on. So, for example, there might be things on non-clinical development. So, some of the preclinical things, because I work mostly in the clinical space. So, I would probably never really look at clinical things unless I went and specifically studied those things, or went and worked at a company that was kind of in the pre-IND phase. And there is also a continuing education component. So it's a certification, but then you also have to maintain your certification. And so that, I think, helps with being more current with what the regulations are, because they are changing.
Yeah. So I like to ask this of our guests, which is
Mm-hmm.
to give us one thing that you really love about your job, and then one thing that you don't love so much that keeps you up at night.
I think one thing that I really love about my job is getting to work with other groups. Chandrima knows I'm an extrovert, so like I love, I love talking to people, meeting people. Going to conferences is fun for me. She knows that, like, getting to talk to people about what they do and things like that. So being where I am currently, I get to work with people in other functions and kind of learn about their perspective on the questions that we're trying to answer. And so I think that's fun because I really enjoy like the big picture part of my job, where I kind of get to see all the pieces fit together of, why are we running this study, or how does this model fit into our story of how we're, developing this drug candidate. I think one thing that it's not as fun about my job is, some of the paperwork. Someone does always need to do the paperwork, but as an extrovert, doing paperwork is not as fun as talking to people. So there are parts of my day. There are parts of my day where I am, mostly like working on documents and things like that. And so that's not always the most fun, but it is a necessary part of my job, is to make sure that we do have all the documentation for the project or the question.
Yeah. We talked a little bit or a lot about how you're extroverted, love to go to conferences and talk to people. Can you tell us a little bit about how you go about networking and what you do to keep your networks alive?
That's a good question. That's honestly something I'm still working on. Because I think I have built a network of people who do work in the lab, but I think my network in regulatory is not as strong, because I've only been in my current position for about 2.5 years now. And so I think being extroverted does help, because going to, for example, networking events is not as intimidating, but going up to people and trying to understand their background, see where they come from. I would say it definitely helps if you go with someone who might know a few people there, or if you have something in common. So if you're going to, for example, if you go to a regulatory networking event, other people there are also in regulatory, and so you kind of already have a common denominator, or something that you can talk about. Or if we go to a UC Davis alumni event, like we're all from UC Davis, we can talk about Davis things. So finding just a little bit of information that can help you spark a conversation is helpful. Or if you can also just talk about the events, or things like that are maybe more directly related to where you are. But I would also say that a lot of people are willing to talk to people, early career scientists or professionals, to kind of share their story, just because all of us, I would say, have a different path to where we are. And even though even if you don't exactly align with what they did, it could still give you something to learn from.
Even if you're not an extrovert, I mean, those situations can be easier if if you're going in with sort of a purpose, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of what you sort of want to achieve. I mean, it's conversation, but it's conversation with a purpose, right?
Yeah.
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 Or
I
you can
mean,
even
even if you're,
sorry, go on.
oh, I was going to say, even if your goal is to say, I want to meet one new person at this event.
Yeah.
You don't have to stay long, or I just want to be here for 5-10 minutes. The chances of you staying after that is a little higher once you get to the event, or once you make that first step, because you're already there, or you've already started that conversation. You like, maybe you don't want to be rude and just like walk off.
Exactly.
But yeah, or if you can say like, oh, I want to, like, this person I know is going, like, I'm gonna go with them, then it's a little less intimidating to go by yourself.
That is my favorite strategy. Find an extrovert friend and go with them.
That's me.
That is how I went to a lot of networking events in grad school, because Cindy was going. So kind of going back to this networking question, you are one of the few people I know that have never formally interviewed for a job. You kind of networked your way into it. Can you talk a little bit about how you went about doing that, how this position came about, and yeah, how did you find your job?
Yeah. Okay. So a few points of clarification here. I've interviewed for 2 internships, and one of which is the regulatory internship. And I have interviewed for a job when I worked at the aquarium in undergrad. But I have not interviewed for a regulatory affairs position. And I think
you're 2 for 2, it sounds like, right?
Yes. Oh, I guess 3 for 2, because I did get the other internship in
got
in undergrad.
So you obviously have some great interviewing tips also.
Yeah, right.
Well, it is something that I need to work on, because I have not interviewed for a regulatory position. I have interviewed other people to join our team, but I have never been on the interviewing side. But I think what we kind of learn along the way is that all of these spaces are quite small. The biotech space is, even though there's a lot of companies, there's a lot of people who work here, and like at this company and other companies, but how many of those people are regulatory people? How many of those people have worked with each other before? Because a lot of people work at multiple companies, they've worked with other team members, so the number of people in regulatory would be quite small. And so I would say, don't burn bridges, hopefully. I mean, of course, there's always the unique situation where if you really need to do something, that's a different situation. But because a lot of you might run into this person again at a different company, you might need to call them up, and if you really liked working with them, they could join your team, or you could give them a referral to join your team, or maybe you want to join their team at a different company. And so I think being able to network and kind of keep up with people is really important. And I think LinkedIn is really helpful to see where your former colleagues or former lab mates have gone, and being able to congratulate them on positions and things like that. That's a good way to stay connected, and message on LinkedIn if you don't have personal phone numbers and things like that.
So your journey, for the most part, has been pretty linear, it sounds like. But were there doubts along the way? Were there moments during this whole process where you didn't know what you were going to do, and you wasn't sure if you made the right choice and how this was all going to work out, this transition that you made?
I would say I sort of, but also I think that's kind of where my life kind of brought me, because I was pre-med before I went to grad school, as I feel like a lot of grad students are. And I've kind of always been in this like chemistry biology interface. And
Mhm.
so I feel like I have kind of always been in this in between,
Mhm.
where, I can do the biology, I can kind of do the chemistry, I understand both to an extent. But now being able to kind of interface with both and be in this position where I can, pull certain people in depending on what I'm working on has been really helpful. And I think this position also kind of speaks to my strengths of working with others and, being able to ask questions, and things like that has been really helpful. Um, I don't, in terms of like kind of where my career is now, I mentioned at the beginning that there are kind of subspecialties of regulatory affairs. So I kind of landed in the more clinical strategy side, but there are other, areas that I'm interested in learning more about, even if I don't kind of switch specialties in a sense, just to understand, what goes into those things and, how those roles, what that role even entails. And so I think kind of being curious and being, asking questions has been really helpful for kind of everything that I've done.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we want to come out of this podcast is for trainees that are listening to it to take away some general themes that might help them with their own sort of career journey. But at the end of the day, the other thing that comes out of this is, each person's story is their story, right? And this is how your story is played out. And it's, yeah, this is where you find yourself, and it's worked out, right? And everyone's story will work out that way as well. But it'll
Yeah,
be their
exactly.
story.
Yeah, I think what is funny about my current position is that even though I have PhD in my email signature, some people to this day are like, "Oh, Cindy, I didn't know you had a PhD," because having a PhD is not necessarily a prerequisite for getting into regulatory affairs. And so I do get that question a lot of, "Oh, well, how did you get into regulatory?" Because it's not a field that we really learn about in grad school. And so sometimes what happens is, you become a researcher in the lab, and then through conversations and moving around either the same company or multiple companies, you make your way to regulatory kind of later in your career as opposed to earlier in your career.
Kind of riffing off of that point, if there's a grad student or like an undergrad or postdoc who's thinking about going into regulatory, are there any piece of advice you have for what they can do during their time in grad school that will set them up for success so they don't have to take the circuitous route to regulatory affairs?
Yeah. I mean, I think getting into regulatory is sometimes a little difficult because there's not as many entry level positions as there are for, maybe bench research. And so I think one thing that helps is, networking. Networking is I would say important. And, kind of getting to know the people in the space that you're trying to get to. Some other skills that I think are important for regulatory are things like attention to detail, being organized, project management in a sense. We do also have a project management group, which is separate, but being able to kind of look at timelines and understand where questions may be coming from, who is the best person to answer those. It's a lot of the soft skills that we learn in grad school of, reaching out to collaborators potentially, or, other departments at your institution could be helpful. And so being able to kind of work on being organized or, whatever that looks like for you.
Yeah.
But, it's the softer skills that I think are helpful. And then being able to kind of pitch yourself in a way that aligns with the job description or, the position that you're looking for.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And we talked a lot about being organized and soft skills in grad school. And
Mhm.
you're one of the most organized people I know. I know personally in lab, I learned a lot about keeping my like lab work and time organized from you. So can you like talk a little bit about how you kept like manage your projects and manage your time during your PhD for our grad student listeners?
Yeah, please
Yeah.
help us. We all need it.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, obviously it's very different for people, but I
Mhm.
think what is important is for everyone to find what works for them. For me, what works is, and I still do this, I have a to-do list for, now I do it for a to-do list for what I need to do for the week. In
Mhm.
grad school, I used to do like daily to-do lists because, you know, for example, if you need a culture for a mini prep, you have to do it that day, or, you know, tomorrow you can't do your transformation.
Right.
But now, you know, some of my deadlines are a little more not flexible, but they're kind of longer.
Mhm.
And so there's a bigger window of when I need to review certain documents, for example, or, you know, when I need to get this, when I need to follow up with this person about something. Um, and so I think finding the system for you, I also have certain calendars in my Outlook calendar at work for like, oh, this is when I'm expecting, you know, a response about this, or this is when, you know, I need to reach out to this person. Um, to set like reminders in a way that like will work for you, as opposed to, you know, I cannot just like keep everything in my brain because there's too many things in my brain. But I do know that works for some people, that, you know, they don't need a written to-do list all the time. They can kind of, you know, do it as the days come. Or, you know, some people will use Outlook more, where it says like, oh, I need to follow with this person. I don't use the flags on Outlook. I use categories for like, oh, I need to respond to this email, or I am waiting for this person to respond. And then I can filter for like, oh, all the people that I'm waiting for a response for, you know, did I get that response yet? So I think finding systems that work for you, and you know, it'll change. Like I only started using categories in Outlook in the last like 6 months probably.
Mhm.
So it definitely depends, but being able to organize your thoughts in a way that makes sense to you, if that's a stack of post-its, then it's a stack of post-its.
And there's nothing more satisfying than crossing something off your to-do list, right? It's
Yes,
so
I
wonderful
personally
feeling.
have to like cross it off. I know some people have a digital to-do list, but to me it's not as satisfying, so I have to, you know.
You guys probably can't see that, but that's my crossed off to-do list. I love it.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
that's a
great.
productive day already.
Yeah, it looks like
Well,
you have a
there's
lot of
another
things
side, so.
crossed off. But
Yeah.
yeah, so it definitely depends on the person. But you know, even if you have a system, like how can you make it better? Or like how can you automate it more, or, you know, make it easier for you to find out the information you need to find out?
That's awesome. So there's this one last question I like to ask all of our guests when they come on the podcast, and it's something I
Mhm,
think about myself also. So if you had a way to meet your younger self, maybe sometime when you were finishing up undergrad or starting grad school, what
mhm.
is one thing you'd like to tell her about how her career would play out?
I think, and I give this advice to when we have like uh student visitors too,
Mm-hmm.
is to always keep an open mind, because you don't know what you don't know. And
Mm-hmm.
that's also something that I, you know, have in my current job, where I don't know, you know, I've only been in my position for a little, almost 2.5 years. I don't know what I don't know. And so asking questions, being curious has really been helpful for me. Um, and so I would probably say, you know, keep asking questions, keep, you know, learning, because that's
Mm-hmm.
how you, even if you learn that you don't like something, that's still valuable because you don't know what you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So keep an open mind. You know, there are things that we have today, like AI, that we didn't have, in when I graduated from college, or that kind of thing, like 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So the thing that you might go into might not exist yet, or it might just be starting out. And so keep asking questions, keep learning.
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much, Cindy, for spending time with us today. We really appreciate learning more about your career and regulatory affairs. And then for our listeners who want to continue the conversation, please visit our ASBMB active site where you can comment on today's discussion and ask more questions. Thanks, everyone.